on reviewing The Angel of Death, The Story of Smallpox by Gareth Williams. So some more interesting facts around smallpox and vaccination. The word vaccination was coined in around 1800 by someone called Richard Dunning. It's an interesting fact. Another interesting fact about cowpox is that it survives well if dried, and that helped, because it survives well if dried, that helped with the vaccination. It was a little bit gross. What they used to do was something called arm-to-arm vaccination, which is where they collected lymph from the blisters on an arm, on someone's arm, and then so someone who'd been vaccinated, they'd then collect the lymph from that person's arm, and then they'd vaccinate someone else in like a chain of vaccination going from arm to arm. Obviously this was quite unsafe, and it carried the risk of transmitting diseases, particularly syphilis, and other bacterial infections could be spread that way. They didn't have the understanding that we do today about like germs and things like that, so it was quite unsafe, and often the same needles would be used as well. And then after the dried, first of all we had the dried vaccine, but then afterwards they created a liquid vaccine which extended its shelf life. It was mixed with glycerine, and that also killed off the contaminating bacteria to make it a bit safer. But yeah, it could still spread diseases from the donor to the recipient, however. Now cows, interestingly, cows were inoculated with cowpox from an infected cow or a human vaccination blister, which was then used for vaccination, again in sort of like chain of vaccination. The lymph was rubbed into the cow's flank because that was considered to be more convenient than the udder, and they were known as vaccination calves. And there were mobile vaccination centres where these cows were taken to people, so you could get vaccinated straight from the cow, which is interesting. Large scars meant that the vaccination had taken. No scars often meant no protection for the vaccine, which would mean that the person might need to be vaccinated again. Because with the smallpox vaccine, using cowpox, it did result in a scar. And that was a sign that the vaccine had taken. Vaccination was first used in 1796. That was the date when it was first used. Initially arm-to-arm vaccination, but like I said, it did spread syphilis. In England, arm-to-arm vaccination was banned in 1898, so quite late. And eventually humans were barred from all stages of vaccine production, and lymph was then used, and lymph was then generated exclusively in calves. And the actual active virus in the smallpox vaccine was a virus called Vaccinia. Vaccinia, obviously meaning cowpox, really, derived from cows. However, they later did some DNA testing on Vaccinia, and they found that it wasn't actually derived. It was subtly different to cowpox. And this came as quite a surprise because they were expecting it to be very similar to cowpox, because they thought that it was basically more or less the same virus that had just evolved a little bit in the vaccination process. But it seems that Vaccinia is more likely to have evolved from horsepox, not cowpox, which is quite interesting. We're not entirely sure where Vaccinia came from. It's a bit of a mystery virus. It's considered to be a hybrid between smallpox, cowpox, horsepox, and possibly some other pox viruses. Now, interestingly, in 1896, the mild variant of the variola minor, invaded America, and then that became the main strain there. So throughout the 20th century, variola minor became the main variant of variola in America, and it kind of pushed variola major out. So, which was good because obviously variola major was a more severe disease, but variola minor did spread very quickly, and it did result in epidemics. Interestingly, in the UK, there was actually a smallpox outbreak in Bradford in 1962. That was just one of several outbreaks that were imported from elsewhere, because smallpox was no longer endemic in the UK. From about sort of 1930 onwards, it was no longer endemic, but it could still be imported from elsewhere. And one of these outbreaks occurred in Bradford in 1962, and 2 cases occurred. They hadn't gone abroad, but it turned out they had caught it for someone who'd come to the UK from abroad. And yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. And as you're probably aware, smallpox obviously has now been, thankfully, completely eliminated from the face of the earth. The WHO did a massive vaccination campaign beginning in, I think it's around sort of 1966, and the vaccination campaign was meant to last about 10 years, and they were pretty much on target. It ended up being, I think, just slightly over 10 years, and basically smallpox had been pushed right to smallpox was now endemic in only a few regions of the earth by that time. India, which was the main place where it still existed, and parts of Africa. In Somalia in Africa, where smallpox was still very much there in presence, it was more variola minor, for milder form, but in India, variola major was still causing a lot of death. And yeah, so the WHO launched a big elimination campaign because they decided that they were really going to try once and for all to eliminate smallpox off the face of the earth. Because in other parts of the world, vaccination had been in progress for a long period of time, and that had meant that smallpox was no longer endemic in most of the world. But in those areas, there was a lot of resistance to vaccination in those areas. It still was very much a presence. And yeah, it was this massive push using ring vaccination, where they'd basically contact and trace, they'd find anyone who'd been in contact with anyone with smallpox, they'd get them vaccinated. They'd hand out, they'd show people cards of smallpox victims so that people would know what they were looking for, and then they would be taken to anyone who had smallpox was then put into quarantine. And then all the people that had been in contact with them were vaccinated. Often there's a lot of resistance, so they had to use a lot of very clever, cunning strategies, essentially to force people to be vaccinated. But that was the only way, because they were really intent on getting this horrendous, horrible disease off the face of the earth, and it worked. And the actual official declaration that we were free from smallpox came in 1980. I think it was around off the top of my head, it was around 1978, at the end of 1978, when the last case of variola minor occurred in Somalia. But they then waited 2 years for the official declaration, just to make sure that there were no cases left, and it was eradicated completely off the face of the earth. Smallpox is still kept in 2 main laboratories. There's one in America, in Atlanta, I think, and the other one is in Russia, in very high security laboratories. The smallpox virus is kept for research purposes. There has been calls for them to destroy the smallpox virus, but some people are arguing, that it's important for research. It might help us to understand other viruses. There are fears, obviously, of bioterrorism and things like that. Obviously, the laboratories are heavily guarded, so hopefully that wouldn't happen. So yeah. Whether or not they will eventually get rid of it, who knows? But they do keep they do keep the virus essentially frozen, like a genie in a bottle, really, almost in suspension for research purposes. And people who work with the virus obviously still get vaccinated, just for precaution's sake. The actual vaccination itself does carry quite a high rate of side effects, and it's considered to have quite a number of risks. So obviously, because smallpox has now been eradicated off the earth, there's no point in everyone getting vaccinated, because now the risks would outweigh, any gain from it. But obviously, when smallpox was rife, the risks from the vaccination were considerably lower than the risks from the disease. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this little review of the Angel of Death, and I'll try and talk about something more cheery next week. So thank you for watching.